Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to stand before you under the banner of the Red Liberal de América Latina, RELIAL, representing not only the cause of freedom, but also the resilience of those who, despite the gravest of challenges, refuse to surrender their dignity. Today, I have been asked to share my personal story, but also the reality of authoritarian threats, and most importantly, a call to action for all of us, liberals, to rise to the challenge of our times. In April 2018, Nicaragua experienced a civic insurrection of historic proportion. The streets of our cities filled with citizens outraged by decades of abuse under the Sandinista regime of Daniel Ortega. The spark for this uprising came initially from students, whose courage ignited a spirit of resistance in millions. They were soon joined by independent citizens from rural and urban areas, autoconvocados, as we say in Nicaragua, self-organized, united in their demand for freedom. But the regime's response was brutal. Snipers were deployed to target peaceful protesters, a method that claimed at least 350 lives in 2018 alone. When this criminal strategy failed to suppress dissent, the regime launched Operación Limpieza, Operation Cleanup, employing armed groups to retake control of the cities. Arbitrary arrests followed, leading to over 2,000 incarcerations in the next 3 years. To this day, more than 100 political prisoners languish under inhumane conditions in Nicaragua. I was one of those prisoners. For 611 days, I was in a maximum security prison, deprived of basic human dignity. Upon my release last year, I was stripped of my Nicaraguan nationality and expelled, deported from Nicaragua alongside 221 others. 6 years after the protests of 2018, the dictatorship remains entrenched, clinging to power through relentless repression. Nearly 15% of Nicaraguan population has been forced into exile, and the regime has dismantled over 6,000 organizations, including universities, international mission, churches, human rights groups, and every independent press outlet. According to Freedom House's latest Freedom of the World report, Nicaragua holds the grim distinction of being the country with the greatest decline in freedoms over the last decade, a tropical version of North Korea. The consolidation of Ortega's dictatorship is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader crisis, the global democratic deficit. For 18 consecutive years, the world has seen a regression in freedoms, with Latin America among the regions hit. In Venezuela, the courage of Maria Corina Machado, our friend, inspires us as she challenges a regime intent on suppressing her vision for a democratic future in Venezuela. In Cuba, the Patria y Vida remains vibrant despite brutal repression, with over 1,000 arbitrary arrests. In Bolivia, leaders like Yanine Áñez and Luis Fernando Camacho are imprisoned for standing against tyranny. Yet, authoritarian threats do not come solely from the radical left. While the malevolence of Marxism and its dehumanizing ideologies is evident, we must also confront emerging political movements that, under the guise of traditional values, sow hatred, intolerance, and violence. These movements often glorify strong men like Vladimir Putin, promising order and security at the cost of our liberties. As liberals, particularly those rooted in the classical tradition of defending individual freedoms, property rights, and human dignity, we must denounce, without hesitation, all forms of authoritarianism, whether they arise from the left or from the right. The liberal vision offers a path forward in this chaotic and divided world. By focusing on the dignity of every individual, we can rekindle hope in building a free society where differences are resolved with civility. To achieve this, we must embrace a bold and unapologetic liberalism, confronting intolerance with the same resolve with which we have opposed communism. To resist authoritarian threats effectively, we must strengthen our synergy of efforts. The autocrats of the world coordinated efforts with precision. But we, the defenders of freedom, often remain fragmented. This must change. Let us create a united liberal family. Think tanks, activists, political parties, and citizens must work together, focusing on shared values rather than divisions. Our strength lies in unity. Also, the plight of political prisoners is a moral imperative. Advocating for their release and amplifying their stories must remain central to our efforts. I am grateful that RELIAL has accepted to include this fundamental action as one of our priorities. Also, combating disinformation. Autocrats weaponize falsehoods to undermine democracy. We must counter these narratives with truth, equipping activists with the tools to fight the battle on digital and grassroots fronts. We must also support liberal movements open to diversity. Strong movements are plural and inclusive. Women, youth, entrepreneurs, and environmental groups, for example, bring perspectives and energy that make our coalitions more resilient and harder for autocrats to suppress. Finally, bridging divides. We must close the gap between grassroots movements and political parties. A cohesive pro-democracy front is essential to present a viable alternative to authoritarianism. It's important. My dear friends, the stakes could not be higher. The defense of democracy is not a task for governments alone. It is a duty for all of us, from the streets of Managua to the squares of Caracas, Havana, and La Paz. The courage of ordinary citizens reminds us that the fight for freedom is universal. Let us rise to this challenge. Let us build an ecosystem of democracy, transnational, inclusive, and resilient. Together, we can ensure that the liberal ideals of individual dignity, tolerance, and human rights prevail over the forces of repression. Despite the darkness, I remain hopeful. Hope lives in the hearts of those who dare to resist, who dream of a future where freedom is not a privilege but a birthright. Even in the deepest chaos, where oppression seeks to extinguish hope, the human spirit endures. To those suffering in the prisons of dictatorships, we say, you are not alone. Your courage inspires us to reject hatred, for hatred is the weapon of the oppressor. Let us respond with strength and dignity, for freedom may be delayed, but it can never be defeated. Thank you.